Radio Retrofuture has been made possible by the Groene Vee absinthe, some of the best artisanal absinthe from the Netherlands. You can find their selections of homemade absinthe, both white and green, on thegroenevee.nl/en, or click the link down in the description.
Radio Retrofuture.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Radio Retrofuture with a very kind of surprise episode, I suppose, with a new friend of mine from Indonesia. Right now he's in Taiwan, Sebestian Susilo. How are you, Sebestian?
I am good, thank you.
We have not really spoken before, so could you please introduce yourself and what you do?
My name is Sebestian Susilo, and I was actually born in Jakarta, Indonesia. And I'm currently 26 years old. I'm studying in an art school right now here in Taiwan. And I have been actually living in Taiwan for like 7 years right now. So I'm pretty familiar and much more familiar than Indonesia.
So, actually I invited you on to talk a little bit about Plesiran Tempo Doeloe. I hope I didn't butcher that name.
No, you didn't.
Okay. Could you explain a little bit what it is to the people who are not familiar with it?
It's actually two words. Plesiran means to have fun and to walk around and have some leisure time. And Tempo Doeloe means it means in the past. So it's like you are having fun or you are taking some times in the past. So it's actually you can go around some places in Indonesia that some buildings or some plazas that are actually buildings that were used by the Dutch in the past. Mainly the Dutch, because the Dutch has been colonizing Indonesia for like 350 years. So it's actually a very long history, and the Dutch also built a lot of buildings and a lot of things in Indonesia, especially in Jakarta, because it was the main huge city in the Dutch East Indies. So there's actually a lot of buildings and a lot of things that have been built by the Dutch, and I have been there for a couple of times, and I must say that it's actually very pretty.
All right. And are you also, do you consider yourself a member of that movement?
I'm actually quite a person who likes old stuff. I'm not really, I didn't classify myself as anyone or in any category, but I just love some vintage stuff, especially in Indonesia, which is my hometown.
Okay, and could you explain a little bit about the history of Plesiran Tempo Doeloe itself? How that came to be?
Actually, I didn't know that it was a thing until like 5, 6, 7 years ago, because that's when I start to to have some research about the history of my own country. And when I try to visit those buildings or the like museums or some plazas, they are actually renovating all the buildings to cleaner and a better environment. And I didn't see the government has put a lot of effort in the past, but actually they are trying to build those places to be more prettier and more modernized. Yeah, so I think it's like a movement for the people in Indonesia, especially in Jakarta, for them to have their times and to see about their history.
How do the Indonesians in general look at the colonial era in this day and age? Because as I understood it from a newspaper article I read, like, let's say, I think about 2012, I think I read about Plesiran Tempo Doeloe in the Netherlands, where there was a photographer who made a series of photos of these Indonesian people in Dutch colonial dress, addressing themselves as mevrouw, which is the Dutch word for a madam, I suppose. Less formal than that. It used to be a very formal term, and it's not anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's very old-fashioned now. In the eyes of the Dutch, who are quite ashamed of that part of their history, it looks really contradictory to see these young Indonesian people dressing up as Dutch colonials. One of the things they explained of how it came to be was that the colonial age was repressed. You were not supposed to talk about it during the reign of Suharto's, of the Suhartos. When Suharto's reign ended, there was a renewed interest in this history. Is that correct?
Oh, well, I'm not sure about the Suharto things because I was not born in his era. I'm not really sure. From my point of view, well, my family, especially my mother's side of my family, my maternal grandparents, they were raised by, surprisingly, they were raised by the Dutch. So my grandfather, he was kind of a slave in a Dutch family. He used to work in a Dutch family when he was really young. And since my grandfather has no parents, his parents has already passed away when he was really young. So he stayed in the Dutch family for a couple of years. And since my grandfather, whom I call him Opa, which means the grandfather in Dutch.
Yeah.
I call my grandfather and grandmother Opa and Oma. As you can see, that the Dutch influence in my maternal side of my family is really pretty huge, pretty heavy, because my grandfather was raised by the Dutch family. He also went to a Dutch school paid by the Dutch family, and it was actually quite privileged for the Indonesians, because there's not a lot of Indonesian who can go to the Dutch school.
Yeah.
So my grandparent, my Opa was really lucky at that time that he could go to a Dutch school and he learned how to speak in Dutch and so on. So even after the independence and his older days, he still speaks Dutch. I learned a few phrases of Dutch words, and I think it's quite interesting, but it's one of my greatest regret that I couldn't learn the whole thing before he passed away in 2008. Yeah. So as you can see, I'm not sure about the other family in Indonesia though, but particularly my family, especially my maternal side of my family, we were raised kind of in a very Dutch influenced culture. Yeah. So yeah, as Indonesian myself, I always, as you can see that, I'm not sure if you can see that I'm actually Chinese Indonesian.
Okay. I'm not that familiar with the people, so
yeah, it's okay, because I think that there's a lot of racial stuff that has been going on in between the Chinese and Indonesian in the past, and I always thought that I was pure Chinese. But then when I did my research in my my own stuff, my journey about finding my past, I do have a lot of Indonesian heritage in my bloodline that I find is really interesting. I have my great grandparents who are Javanese, and another side of family that have some Sundanese, which is people from the West Java. So the more I find, the more interesting that I find that I can relate myself to my own country, and it's quite interesting. Also, I do have Russian also,
okay,
which comes
wow.
from my some of my family that was actually Russian. And this was very unexpected.
The Russians were where were they? They were also on the one of the east coasts areas. They
what I've heard, it was those Russians who emigrated to China, and one of my parents that stayed in China in the past, he married this woman who is partially Russian, and they after that they came to Indonesia for business, and so that so that's what I am right now, and and it's not I'm not a boring or an ordinary Chinese Indonesian. Yeah, the more I find, the more interesting it is. And also, I didn't mention that actually my opa, my grandpa, he used to have a Dutch friend. Actually, is an Indo friend who is Dutch and Indonesian mix, which I think is his neighbor or something. And even right now, even though they have moved to the Netherlands, they live in Zwolle. I'm not sure if and we still have a very good connection between them. They often came to Indonesia, and sometimes when we go to the Netherlands, we always go to the house and visit them. Except me, which who I have never been to the Netherlands before, but my parents and my grandparents, they always went to the Netherlands quite often. So that's why I think I have a lot of influence culturally to the Netherlands, and I do not have any, like as you said earlier before, that some peoples in Indonesia, they split in two different major groups. The one that who love, not really love, but they can relate to the Dutch, or those people who hate the Dutch. And I'm luckily that I think my family belongs to the category that influenced by the Dutch more, and so that I personally I do not have any grudge or any hateful emotion to the Dutch. In contrast, I do have some. I feel connected to the Dutch sometimes when I see some Dutch culture or in the TV or something. Oh, there's something that my grandparents have said, or something that this is something that on my mother's side they sometimes cook some kinds of Dutch cuisine or something, and or even some words that originated from the Dutch, and I feel I will feel quite familiar, and I feel connected to the Dutch. Right. So luckily, I actually feel pretty good. For the Dutch, I feel I feel connected sometimes. Yeah,
it's really really interesting.
It's actually one of my interests to know more about this culture, also because my half side of my family is really influenced by the Dutch. Yeah. So, am I going too far?
No. I'm very interested. Although, of course, I also have a history there. Like my family, for my mother's side, comes from that era. My uncle and my mother were both born there. Except that my parents didn't like. My mother never liked talking about it because she was in a Japanese prison camp.
Oh, yeah.
So, she got some beatings there. But my grandmother did, and she always talked about, especially one of her pet peeves were the Dutch themselves. I don't know if this is a word you use, but we have the word tatak. Are you familiar? Are you familiar with that phrase?
No.
Oh, yeah, it was apparently that's what my.
Oh yeah, I know. Yeah. It kind of pronounced as totox, not like tox.
Totox, okay.
Totox, yeah. It means the pure one, the pure of some ethnicity, particularly for the Dutch. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they described them as the people that came from the Netherlands and didn't want to adapt to Dutch Indonesian culture. And one of the things, one story I remember very well was here we have something called apple mousse, basically apple porridge, and. This was something when children in the Netherlands didn't want to eat. I don't think it's done anymore. But when children were fuzzy eaters, like, I don't want to eat this, they would take apple mousse and pour it all over it and porridge it and would feed it to children. These Totoks, they took apple mousse from the Netherlands, went to Indonesia, and when they didn't want to. I don't know what the mentality was, but they didn't want to eat the Indonesian food, but they had no choice. So they would take an Indonesian dish, would put apple mousse on it, and eat it that way. So that was something my grandmother always talked about these unadjusted Dutch, usually officers and clergymen. So that's one story I recall very vividly on that. But
that was pretty interesting.
yes, but let's talk a little bit more about the Plesiran Tempo Doeloe stuff, because do they have a vision or goal in mind for what they're doing?
I'm not really sure about the goal or the vision, their missions to do that, but I think a lot of people. I'm just guessing though. I'm just guessing that a lot of the residents in Indonesia, they start to appreciate what the Dutch has built up for our country, and since some of them are, especially like those museums and plazas or bridges or the old architecture that the Dutch has built are actually pretty beautiful. And so sometimes I'm guessing that a lot of youngsters, a lot of the young people in Indonesia, they start to appreciate what the Dutch has been done for our country. So they start to, and when they see the old government like the Suhartos, or they didn't do anything for the history, they feel kind of how to say in English? It's they just don't want to feel that it's too late when the buildings have collapsed or has been or
Save what can be
down.
saved, so to speak.
Yeah. So I think a lot of young people nowadays, they start to they want to know more about the history of our country, and so that they made a lot of effort to save what has been saved.
Yeah, one argument I remember from the article very well was that the Dutch Indonesian architecture was a combination of both cultures, and that made them extremely suitable for the climate. And as I understood it, Suharto put an end to that, or at least no new buildings were constructed that way. And now there are students that try to use those colonial architecture, so to speak, to improve on the new. So that's one interesting bit, how they use history to improve the future. That's something I really appreciate, and that's something I appreciate about steampunk as well. And now we're on the subject. Is there such a thing as a steampunk movement in Indonesia that you're aware of?
I'm not sure if there is any steampunk movement. That is a major one. No, I don't think there is right now.
Now that would have been interesting. Because it is... well, we already talked a little bit about our friend Terry. He's getting into steampunk. Is it getting up in Taiwan?
It is a thing I think it's the same for a lot of Asia's countries that have been colonized by other countries. Like in Taiwan, they have been colonized by the Japanese for 50 years. So we do have a lot of rebuilding those Japanese houses or Japanese culture that has been torn or being, a lot of building has been saved by also. So I think it's quite the same with Indonesia. But I think Taiwanese government has put a lot more effort on these issues rather than in Indonesia.
Yeah.
Yeah. Personally, I think that Indonesia's government or Indonesians people, they don't really, mm, at least the older people, they don't really appreciate what the Dutch has been doing in the past. Like as you can see that Dutch is not a national language in Indonesia, never been since the independence. And like as you say that Suharto, they I think he might did that we couldn't talk or shouldn't talk about our past, our being the fact that we have been colonized by the Dutch for 3 centuries. Yeah, so I think starting from the independence, they kind of removed all this the shameful past of Indonesia, and that's why a lot of people that was born in that era was they didn't really appreciate what the Dutch has been doing for our country. But I don't think that is the case for the teenager or the young people right now in Indonesia.
Might it be a kind of a forbidden fruit effect?
I'm not sure if it was that strict because I wasn't born in the Suharto reign, so I'm not sure. But probably I can relate to that because there's no, as you can see, when I was young, there's those a lot of buildings have been the Dutch buildings have been like just ignored, or they didn't do any they didn't do anything for those buildings, which actually are quite pretty. Yeah.
All right.
In my opinion, though.
Yeah. Well, what I've seen of it, it looks beautiful. Of course,
Yeah.
I've been there very long, and long ago, I think I was a teenager when I went there, and I went there with my grandmother and my parents, and I think my youngest sister was with us as well. And it was really weird because my grandmother was in her 70s back then, you know, a very. A woman in her golden years. That's what she looked like back then. And I remember there was no animosity towards us by the people, despite us knowing Dutch. And I remember we were at a bed and breakfast, and there was this veranda, and we were sitting there during the day, and all of a sudden a group of youth came at us, and there was this guy who said hello in Dutch. Or he said, it must have been something like, oh, goedendag mevrouw. Or something like that. A very Dutch phrase. And my sister responded, oh, hello. And then he started the entire conversation in Dutch, surrounded by his friends, because he probably had been... We were the talk in the town. We were at a small city called Manado, which is not a touristic attraction. So, we were the talk of the town. Like, have you heard there are Dutch people here? And this guy spoke fluent Dutch. I don't remember what we talked about, but it's something I remember. And there was also this old fortress, this old colonial VOC fortress, where there was this entire class of Dutch-speaking students, which was quite hilarious to speak fluent Dutch with these people that, well, like you, know very little about Dutch culture itself. So that was very interesting.
Well, I think it's different because it is you were in Manado, right?
Yeah.
Because in Manado, it was heavily influenced by the Dutch culture, much more than Batavia or Jakarta than in the past. Yeah, because I'm not really sure about the history, but I've known that the people, especially in the Sulawesi, the Celebes Island, which Manado is, they were really culturally influenced by the Dutch very, very much. They have a lot of cuisines that represent, I think it's quite similar with the Dutch. Like they have some dessert, like what is it called, klapper tart. I'm not sure if you
Oh,
know
kwark
about
tart?
it. It's actually klapper tart. Yeah,
Klapper tart.
it's
It does sound Dutch.
coconut.
And maybe
Yeah,
it's an old dish, but I can look it up if you want.
it's actually a pie like apple tart.
Okay.
I'm sure. Yeah, but it's klapper, which is means coconut pie.
Okay.
Yeah, it's actually they're trying to copying the Dutch style of dessert, but they instead of using Dutch ingredients, they use the local ingredients, which is coconuts, and so they made a fusion of
Okay.
Dutch
Interesting.
and
Interesting.
Indonesian. Yeah,
Yeah. Well.
and
Go on.
it's very popular dish from Manado. I think so. Yeah, especially yeah in Manado. Whenever we say, oh, there's a store that they're selling clapper tart. Oh, they must be people from the Manado. Yeah, some sort of yeah. Yep, it's pretty much like that in Indonesia.
Yeah. It's funny because one important ingredient in apple tart, Dutch apple tart,
Mm-hmm.
is cinnamon, which
Uh
comes
huh.
from Indonesia. So
Yeah, yeah.
it's very funny how the cultural exchange goes.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but I
And I
also
know there's a lot of
remember. Oh, go ahead.
languages. The languages that used in Manado, they have more Dutch rather than Indonesian vocabulary.
Okay.
That's yeah. So I think people from that area is really Dutch influence much more than people from Java or other parts of the islands.
Hmm. Yeah,
Mm.
my mother was born on Java.
Mm-hmm.
But I also recall there was this villa where we stayed at for a while. I'm not sure it was Monado or another place, but there was this old lady that grew up during the colonial era, and she was so fond of my grandmother.
Oh,
She was really clingy. Yeah, it was like, oh, this was such a blast for the past of her, and it makes me kind of wonder, like, how do the Indonesians feel now about the colonial era? You already said, yeah, the older ones don't like to talk about it. The newer ones, they appreciate the
mm-hmm.
what the Dutch left behind. So,
Mm-hmm.
what are the feelings now about that colonial period in general?
In general, I think since a lot of young people are coming right now, a lot of young people are going born. They haven't experienced the colonial times, and they can't really appreciate how to say that. They
They
couldn't feel how to be colonized by other people,
Yeah, they only
and
see the good
so
parts of it, so to speak.
yeah. They only see we have some Dutch buildings. Oh, we have some Dutch cuisine. Oh, we have some Dutch in our language, and it is something that you can relate to the Western country. You know, like the Western is more like industrialized or more modern. That is something that we can show off to the world that oh yeah we have something that is relate to the West.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
I think.
it has
Mm,
become in their eyes it has become something of a prestige object,
mm,
prestige
yeah,
past, so to
yeah,
speak.
yeah.
Interesting, interesting. Yeah,
But I
because
think it's only applicable for the young people,
yeah,
especially
understandably.
like
Um,
our generation.
yeah, based on my own experience, I can see that the older generation is also kind of split on that
Hmm.
subject,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
yeah,
sure.
there are most definitely, the Dutch have done some terrible things, like we had Westerling. I don't know if you are familiar with his name. He was one of the commanding officers of the so-called politionele acties, as they were called. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Basically, they were just an occupying force to, you know, restore law and order for the Dutch government, and failed. But he especially was extremely brutal. And
Mm-hmm.
back then, and we're talking about the 50s, he was like hailed as this hero. And now I find I don't think you'll find an image of him anywhere these days. But yeah, so the Dutch really associate, you know, the colonial era with the Dutch oppressing other people. Uh, so to hear that to these former colonies, or at least the younger generations, it's now a kind of a prestige object. It's really weird how perspectives can change.
Yeah, and especially when some like my parents sometimes they watch the news and see how the Indonesian government treated the country, and they start to get disappointment from our own government, and they sometimes they kind of say things like, "Oh, I wish that the Dutch still colonized us, and it will be much better than right now." I'm not sure if they are really uh, it was just a saying, or they really want to be
Uh,
colonized again. I'm
uh,
not sure, but it is something that my
I,
parents will, will
all I can
say.
say on that is I remember an art piece in Amsterdam. There is this museum that talks that's about well, to us, exotic cultures. Like they've got
Mhm.
departments on African cultures and all that kind of stuff, and Indonesian, of course. They had this special exposition on post-colonial Indonesia, and there was
Mhm.
this artist who made 3 statues of Indonesian generals in European dress. Indonesian generals in the
Mhm.
European dress, and the lower half of their bodies were that of reptiles on cartwheels.
No.
And the title of that art piece was "New Faces, Same Dinosaurs." So, and what you experience a lot of colonial era of post-colonial countries, and also in Afghanistan and Pakistan, all those countries that were invaded by the United States, Iraq, I meant, um,
Mhm.
all those countries that were invaded by the United States, for example, they all have the same officials in control before and
Mhm.
after. So when there was indeed independence, I can bet that a lot of the people that were in control back then are still in control now.
Mhm.
Except, yeah, they had probably had far more liberty to be because you know Suharto is not known for his how do you say, for his good behavior, so to speak. Um, so yeah, there was probably a lot of nepotism going around back then, and no, now there were no foreign officials to say what you're doing is corruption. Of course, they were also corrupt, so it doesn't really matter. But yeah, it's yeah. We have an expression in Dutch, "led against old iron," so that's probably what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, actually, I want to talk a little bit more about retrofuturism. So, what is, because you live in Taiwan, you're from Indonesia. Uh,
Mhm.
how much retrofuturism is there going on right now, and what forms does it take? Because do they have their own variation on steampunk, for example?
Do you mean in Taiwan or in Indonesia?
Whatever you want to talk about, whatever examples you
Uh,
can think of.
uh, let's talk about the in Taiwan, which I'm more familiar.
Okay.
Yeah. As you know, that Taiwan has been colonized by the Japanese for 50 years. After, yeah, I think it's starting from the late uh,
19th
I think
century.
yeah, 19th century to 1945 when Japan has lost from the World War II. It spanned for about 50 years, and I think it's kind of the same situations like in Indonesia. There's actually a movie about the Japanese people who was born in Taiwan and were sent back to Japan afterwards, after the war.
Mhm.
And it states how, the whole movie is about, it's actually, and they document those people who were born in Taiwan but has to left Taiwan after the war, and they went to Japan, and how they couldn't adapt the environment in Japan because they were not born there.
Yeah.
And they try, because they, some of them, they couldn't really adapt the environment, and they, when they speak Japanese, the local Japanese say that, oh, you have some accents, that you must not be Japanese, and they were forced to say that they were Taiwanese, but actually they were ethnically Japanese.
Yeah, right.
So it's kind of like, how do you say that, identity crisis.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, you do not know where do you come from or how you label yourself. Are you Taiwanese or are you Japanese? And it's actually a very new thing for the Taiwanese, because before the movie was there was no a major topics or a major thing. It was not a major thing to talk about the
No,
Japanese
right.
people who was born in Taiwan.
Mhm.
So after that movie went to the cinemas, and it became a boom. A lot of people started to talk about, who are actually Japanese, but
They were they were
yeah,
culturally Taiwanese, I suppose.
yeah. And there's are some people in Taiwan also, that some Japanese, they do not want to leave Taiwan, and they adapt a Taiwanese name, a Chinese name, and they start to learn Chinese language, and they change their name to a Chinese name, and they lie to their family that, oh, I'm Taiwanese, but actually she's from Japan, she's Japanese. Not yeah, some kind of stories are
Yeah.
being digged out, yeah, after that movie. So I think it's kind of a phenomena that is happening from the last 2 or 3 years in Taiwan right now. I'm not sure if it's suit for the topics that you really
No, no,
want,
no.
or
Still,
yeah,
it's very interesting to hear.
yeah. But I'm
Because
kind of surprised that this kind of topics is kind of new things here in Taiwan, because in back in Indonesia we do have a lot of Indos. They're like those people, Dutch and Indonesian mixed people that were born in Indonesia, or yeah, it's not a new thing in Indonesia, because Indo's community or Indo's culture has already been in Indonesia for pretty long time. Yeah.
yeah,
So
I
I find
guess
it
that the
interesting.
Dutch are probably far more visible.
Yeah,
So
probably.
it's easier for them to connect well, the kind of tribalism you would expect
Hmm.
from people that look alike.
Yeah,
Do you have a lot of experience with Japanese people?
yeah, young generations, the same age with mine,
Okay.
probably. Yeah, one or two.
Because and correct me if this is false, but what I hear is that the Japanese are extremely xenophobic, not so much racist as they are terrified of foreign people.
Uh-huh.
Is that true?
I think they are terrified people who speaks English.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you mean the young generation right now,
No,
or?
that's a very generalized statement, but it's what the stories that come out of Japan. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious what your experience is with Japanese people. That maybe is this an older generation thing, or is it a younger generation thing, or is it completely false?
I don't think the younger generations, the foreign stuff, they kind of adapt with new things also,
Hmm.
but particularly they still they I find really a lot of Japanese people have hard time studying foreign language. That's
Okay.
like a fact. Yeah, I think everyone will agree.
I sometimes hear the so-called English. You probably are you
Yeah,
familiar with the English memes? Yes. So
yes.
that's you know, if you have a bad day, just look up an English meme page and you laugh your ass off. It's
Yeah,
so
yeah.
hilarious. And what I
I've
heard.
actually studied Japanese for quite a long time, so I can communicate with
Oh,
Japanese,
okay.
standard Japanese. Yeah, so I kind of understand why they have some difficulties when learning new languages, because their language is sometimes if you are born speaking Japanese, then I can probably guess that it is really going to be hard to study a foreign language, which I can understand by after learning their language.
Okay. I also hear, and maybe this is old news or just false entirely, but
Uh-huh.
I also heard that they learn languages like English as if it were Japanese, so they learn completely wrong sentence structures and stuff like that. Is that?
They do have a very different structure compared to Chinese or English or any European language. I think for me, that who speaks Chinese, English, and Indonesian, I do have some difficulties to learn Japanese as well because they have really different grammar structure.
Kind of think of it. We haven't really talked about what you do, so let's talk about that.
Oh,
So what
okay.
do you do? Terry told me you're really into you know, studying your own colonial past.
Yeah.
What else do you do?
Oh, I'm actually a student, art student right now. I'm studying graduate in a graduate school, and I'm majoring in visual communication. Yeah, I do some photograph, just amateur photograph. I do like taking photos, and I really appreciate a lot of vintage stuff. And I gained some interest when I was quite old enough, like after university. And I just realized that a lot of my older parents, my grandparents, they have already passed away.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's one of my big regret as well that I have no chance to know more about my history when my grandparents are still alive.
Right.
So I'm trying to dig out a lot of vintage photograph from my family as much as possible,
Okay.
and I try to know more about my family history. And the more I find, the more interesting that my family is. So yeah, it's like a treasure for me.
Mm-hmm. All right.
And in the future, I really want to do more research about my family in the future, and I probably do a lot more photograph works.
All right.
Well, yeah.
And do you
Oh,
have a an interest in retrofuturism in general as well, or?
I'm not sure if it is kind of a movement that you have mentioned before. I just want to show that to the community that we should appreciate the past, and instead of forgetting about the past, we should learn more about our history and know who you are, why you are living here, and why you are here. And I think it's really important for every people.
I think those
Mhm.
are good words to end on.
Yeah.
I think we'll leave it at that, ladies and gentlemen, for today. Well, thank you, Sebastian, for being on the show.
Yep.
I thought it was
You're
really
welcome.
interesting to hear something about post-colonial Indonesia and Taiwan. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching, and as always, make it your way.